It was 2:30 in the morning. I woke up because I heard something moving in my room. The soft, unmistakable sound of someone's weight shifting on the mattress beside me. Not a dream, not the building settling, something real. I reached over and turned on the bedside lamp. Priya, my girlfriend's best friend, was sitting on the edge of my bed, hair soaked through from what I'd later learn was a walk in the rain she barely remembered taking, shaking, her hands gripping the edge of the comforter like she needed something solid to hold on to. "Don't freak out," she said, before I even had a chance to open my mouth. I didn't ask why she was there. I just looked at her eyes and understood, right away, that whatever was happening had nothing to do with the two of us. It had to do with something chasing her. My name is Cal Mercer. I'm 30 years old, and I work as an audio technician at an independent recording studio in Logan Square, Chicago. The kind of job where my hours never line up with anyone else's schedule. More late nights than early mornings. More headphones than conversation. I mix tracks for local bands, occasionally help out with post-production on a podcast or two, and spend most weekends in the small home setup I've built in my spare bedroom, running my own projects just for the satisfaction of getting a sound exactly right, the kind of work that rarely earns much recognition beyond the small circle of musicians who actually understand the difference between a mix that's fine and one that's actually finished. I got into audio work almost by accident, helping a friend record a demo in college and realizing, somewhere in the middle of that first session, that I liked the precision of it more than almost anything else I'd tried. There's something about the work that suits my temperament. Hours spent adjusting a single frequency until it sits exactly right. The satisfaction of a mix that finally clicks into place after dozens of failed attempts. My father used to joke that I had the patience of a man twice my age, and I think he was onto something. I've never been especially quick to react to things, in music or otherwise. I tend to sit with a problem, turn it over, wait until the right response becomes obvious rather than forcing one out before I'm ready. That trait served me well in the studio for years, before it ever mattered in quite the way it mattered that night. I live alone, 6th floor of a converted brick building, an apartment that's big enough for one person, and comfortable enough that I've never felt any particular urge to change that arrangement. The building itself is old, good bones, thick walls that keep the noise of my late-night mixing sessions from becoming anyone else's problem, which matters more than you'd think when your job occasionally requires blasting the same 8 bars of a song, 40 times in a row at 11 at night. I chose the apartment specifically for that reason, walking through it with the landlord, and knocking on the walls like some kind of amateur inspector until I was satisfied nobody would complain about my hours. I'd been dating Nadia for 8 months at that point. She's a commercial photographer, travels a lot for work, has this restless energy that I've always found appealing. Precisely because it's so different from my own steadier pace. She'd fly out for shoots in other cities several times a month, come back with stories about difficult clients and beautiful light and hotel rooms she couldn't wait to leave. And I'd listen from the comfort of a life that never asked me to pack a bag on short notice. We balanced each other reasonably well, at least on paper. She pulled me out of my routines. I gave her somewhere quiet to land between trips. 8 months is enough time to learn where two people overlap and where they don't, though I hadn't yet let myself think too hard about which category we were settling into. Nadia talked about Priya constantly, in the particular way people talk about a best friend who's been there since childhood. Priya always says, "Priya would never," that kind of thing. She and Priya had grown up 2 streets apart back in Ohio, gone to the same college by coincidence, and stayed close through every relocation and career shift since. the kind of friendship that survives distance and different life paths, because the two of them simply decided, early on, that it would. For the first couple months of dating Nadia, Priya existed for me mostly as a character in stories, someone I'd absorbed secondhand without ever having met. Sharp opinions and a dry sense of humor filtered entirely through Nadia's retelling. I pictured her a certain way in my head, based entirely on those stories, and I remember being mildly surprised, the first time I actually met her, at how little that picture matched the real thing. I actually met Priya for the first time at Nadia's birthday dinner, about 6 months before that night. A small gathering at a restaurant Nadia loved on the north side. The kind of place with mismatched chairs and a menu that changed every season, tucked between a laundromat and a shuttered storefront that had been empty as long as anyone could remember. She was quieter than Nadia's descriptions had led me to expect, checking her phone more than seemed casual, turning it face down each time, like she was trying to keep whatever was on the screen contained. I found out afterward, Marcus, her ex, was under criminal investigation at the time, and the stress of it was sitting just under the surface of everything she did that evening. We only exchanged a handful of sentences that night, nothing memorable, some small talk about the restaurant, and a passing comment about a photography exhibit she'd recently seen. What I noticed, without fully articulating it to myself, was that this was someone working hard to look fine. Over the following months, I saw Priya occasionally, usually through Nadia. A group dinner here, a coffee run there. The ordinary overlap that happens when your girlfriend's best friend is a regular fixture in her life. Priya was pleasant enough in those settings, but reserved. The kind of person who answers questions fully, but rarely volunteers more than what's asked. There was one dinner, a few months into my relationship with Nadia, where Priya mentioned, almost in passing, that she'd recently ended things with someone, no further detail offered. The subject closed the moment it opened. I remember Nadia glancing at her quickly across the table in that moment, a look I didn't understand at the time but would come to recognize later as concern layered under a friend's practiced discretion, the look of someone who knew far more than she was letting show, and had decided the dinner table wasn't the place to show it. I didn't think much about her beyond that. She was simply a fixture of Nadia's world, someone I was polite with, and nothing more, the kind of secondary character in a relationship who exists mostly at the edges of shared dinners and holiday gatherings. I want to be clear about something. Looking back on that period, I never once thought of Priya as anything other than Nadia's friend, a person I liked well enough in the limited context I knew her, but not someone I spent any real time thinking about outside the rooms we happened to share. Whatever came later grew entirely out of what happened that night and the months that followed it, not out of anything simmering beforehand that I simply hadn't noticed. There's a spare key to my apartment wrapped in a strip of blue tape, my system for keeping spares distinguishable from my actual set. A habit left over from years of losing track of which key opened what. A small organizational quirk that turned out, eventually, to matter far more than I ever expected a piece of colored tape to matter. I'd given it to Nadia around the 3rd month we were together, for practical reasons, in case she needed to grab something while I was traveling for work. Nothing more sentimental than that. She kept it on her own keyring, and I mostly forgot it existed. After Marcus got arrested, and Priya moved to a new address she didn't share widely, Nadia passed that same key along to Priya. "Just in case you ever need it," she told her. Cal's place is close by, and he's not the type to ask a lot of questions. I had no idea any of this had happened. Nobody had asked me first. And honestly, if they had, I don't think I would have hesitated to say yes. But nobody asked, and that detail would matter more than I understood at the time. I don't know exactly when I started thinking of Priya as more than Nadia's friend, more than a peripheral character who occasionally showed up at dinners. If I trace it back honestly, it probably started that very first night, watching her hold herself together at my kitchen table at 3 in the morning, watching her apologize for existing in my apartment when she was the one who'd survived something terrifying to get there. There was a strength in her that had nothing to do with performance, nothing to do with trying to seem okay for an audience. It was simply who she was underneath the fear, and I don't think I'd ever seen that particular quality in anyone quite so clearly before. I remember, too, a smaller moment from those 2 nights she stayed on my couch. The second morning, finding her already awake when I got up, sitting by the window with a cup of coffee she'd made herself, watching the street below like she was cataloging every car that passed. I didn't say anything about it. I just made my own coffee and sat across from her, and we watched the street together for a while without either of us needing to explain what we were watching for. That kind of quiet solidarity doesn't happen with just anyone. I understood that even then, though I wouldn't have called it anything more significant than simple decency at the time. To understand how Priya ended up sitting on the edge of my bed at 2:30 in the morning, you have to go back through what had actually been happening to her over the previous months. A slow, quiet escalation that I had almost no visibility into until it landed, all at once, in the middle of my apartment. It's strange, looking back, how much can be happening in someone's life immediately adjacent to your own without you having any idea how a person can sit across from you at dinner, carrying real fear, and you walk away from that meal thinking only about whether the wine was any good. Marcus Webb had been released early, about 2 months before that night, on good behavior, an outcome nobody had really expected given the severity of the original charges, armed harassment serious enough that it should have kept him inside considerably longer. Priya got the notification through the court system and didn't tell Nadia right away. She didn't want to worry her, didn't want to become, in her own words later, the friend who's always in crisis. I understand that instinct more than I probably should. There's a particular kind of pride that keeps people from asking for help, even when they desperately need it. A belief that needing rescue makes you somehow less capable, less whole. Priya carried that belief like armor for longer than was good for her. Not long after his release, she started getting texts from unknown numbers. Nothing she could immediately prove came from him. No direct threats explicit enough to take straight to police. Just enough ambiguity to keep her constantly on edge without giving her anything concrete to act on. A message that simply read, "I know where you work now." Another, days later, describing a coat she'd worn that same morning, details specific enough to make clear someone had actually seen her, actually been close enough to notice, close enough to catch details most strangers would never register. The specific cut of a coat, the exact street she'd crossed. Each one alone could be explained away, dismissed as coincidence or a wrong number. Together, they formed a pattern she understood perfectly well, even without being able to prove it to anyone else. She told me later that she'd started varying her routes to work, taking different trains at different times, small changes that felt paranoid in the moment and, in hindsight, turned out to be exactly the kind of caution that probably kept things from escalating. Sooner than they did, though she also admitted it had cost her sleep, cost her focus at a job that required precision. The constant low hum of vigilance eating away at her long before Marcus ever actually found her new address. 3 weeks before that night, a former neighbor from her old address reached out to mention that someone matching Marcus's description had come around asking questions about her, knocking on doors up and down the block with a photograph on his phone, claiming to be an old friend trying to reconnect. Patient enough to work through nearly the entire building before anyone thought to ask why an old friend would need to canvass every unit rather than simply calling. The neighbor hadn't given him anything, had actually called Priya the same evening to warn her. A small kindness from someone Priya barely knew that probably mattered more than that neighbor ever realized. She understood at that point that he was actively looking for her. She also understood he didn't yet have her current address. A thin margin of safety that felt increasingly fragile with each passing day. The kind of safety that exists mostly in the gap between what someone knows and what they're one wrong turn away from discovering. The night everything came to a head, Priya was home alone when she got a call from an unknown number. Nobody spoke on the other end. Just breathing, steady and deliberate. The kind of silence that communicates more than words would have. The kind that tells you someone is there specifically to be heard breathing, rather than to say anything at all. He had her new number now. That single fact collapsed whatever margin of safety she'd been holding on to. She tried calling Nadia. No answer, because Nadia was traveling for a shoot and had her phone off for the night, asleep in a hotel room 3 states away with no idea any of this was unfolding. She tried her sister next, then a coworker, neither of whom picked up at that hour. The particular cruelty of a crisis that arrives exactly when everyone you'd normally call happens to be unreachable, each unanswered ring adding another layer to the panic already building in her chest. In a genuine panic, Priya grabbed the spare key Nadia had given her, made her way to my building, and got into the elevator. In the dark, disoriented, running on adrenaline rather than clear thinking, she pressed the wrong floor. 6th instead of the 4th she'd meant to reach, assuming, incorrectly, that Nadia lived on a different floor than she actually did. A mistake that would have seemed almost comical under any other circumstances, the kind of small mix-up that happens to everyone at some point and rarely means anything at all. She let herself into what she believed was Nadia's apartment, and, in the dark, ended up in the bedroom instead of the living room couch she'd intended to wait on, feeling her way along an unfamiliar hallway with her heart still racing from everything that had happened in the previous half hour. When she said, "Don't freak out," she was shaking, her hair still wet from the rain outside, her eyes fixed not on the window but on her own phone screen, thumb hovering over it like she was bracing for it to light up again. I glanced at it. A missed call from an unlisted number, time-stamped 2:17 that morning, 13 minutes before she'd shown up in my room. I didn't have the full picture yet, but I had enough of one to know this wasn't about me walking in on anything strange. This was about something else entirely, something urgent, something that had chased her straight through my front door and, through nothing more than a wrong elevator button, ended up depositing her in a stranger's bedroom instead of her best friend's living room. I didn't ask her why she was in my apartment or why she hadn't called someone else first. I asked one question instead. "Are you safe right now? This exact moment?" "I don't know," she said. "Okay," I told her. "Sit here. I'm going to make some tea." We ended up in my kitchen at 3 in the morning. Priya wrapped in a blanket I'd pulled off the couch, both hands around a mug she wasn't really drinking from. And slowly, in pieces, she told me everything. Marcus, the restraining order, the call that night, the texts over the previous 2 weeks. She hadn't wanted to worry Nadia, hadn't wanted to be seen as someone who needed rescuing every time her life got complicated. I listened without interrupting, without asking the kind of questions that would have made her feel like she was on trial for her own fear. I just listened, refilling her tea once when it went cold, letting the silences sit as long as they needed to, before she picked the story back up, the rain outside picking up and easing off again as the hours moved past 3 and toward 4, neither of us paying much attention to the clock. At some point, around 4 in the morning, She stopped talking altogether and just sat there, staring at the steam coming off her mug. And I didn't fill that silence either. Some things don't need a response. They just need somebody willing to be present while they settle. At some point, she pulled the spare key out of her jacket pocket and set it on the counter between us. I borrowed it from Nadia. I'm sorry for coming in without... I looked at the key, the blue tape wrapped around it, unmistakably mine. I recognized it instantly. I wasn't angry. I just said, I'm glad you had it. The days that followed moved fast in some ways and painfully slow in others. The next morning, I drove Priya to the police station, not because I had any particular expertise in what needed to happen next, but because she was hesitant, and I understood that sometimes what a person actually needs is someone sitting beside them, not someone asking if they're absolutely sure they want to file a report. The intake officer took her through the details methodically, and I watched Priya answer each question with a steadiness that surprised me, given how she'd looked at 3 in the morning the night before, though I noticed her hand trembling slightly against her knee the entire time, a small tell that the composure was costing her something, even as she maintained it. We got the restraining order formally extended, with the added detail of that night's phone call entered into the record. Priya stayed on my couch for 2 nights afterward. Living room, door closed, nothing more complicated than that. I gave her a spare set of sheets, kept my distance during the day so she'd have room to breathe, and mostly just made sure there was food in the fridge she'd actually want to eat. Driving to the store that first afternoon specifically to buy the kind of tea she'd mentioned liking. A small gesture that felt, at the time, like the least I could do. 3 days after our trip to the station, police caught Marcus loitering outside Priya's building, a clear violation of the order that was still fresh on record. According to the officer who called her, he'd been sitting in a parked car across the street for over an hour before anyone noticed him, which told me everything I needed to know about how close this had actually come to going somewhere much worse, a thought I couldn't quite shake for days afterward. Priya got the news sitting in my kitchen and cried for the first time since that night at 2:30 in the morning. Not out of fear this time, out of relief. The kind that only arrives once a threat has finally, tangibly, been removed from the equation. I didn't say much while she cried. I just stayed in the room, refilled her water glass once, and let her have the moment without turning it into something that required commentary. Nadia came back from her trip and heard the whole story, first from Priya, then from me. Her initial reaction was exactly what you'd hope for. Worry for her best friend. Genuine gratitude toward me for stepping in the way I had. She hugged me tightly that first evening back, told me more than once how relieved she was that I'd been there, that things hadn't gone differently, her voice catching slightly each time she said it, the reality of what could have happened clearly settling into her all at once. For about a week, everything between the 3 of us felt settled, almost easy, the kind of collective relief that comes after a genuine crisis has passed, the 3 of us even sharing a celebratory dinner one evening once Marcus was safely back in custody, the mood lighter than it had been in weeks. But over the following days, something else started creeping into Nadia's questions, a different tone entirely, subtle at first, and then less so. It started with small things. An offhand comment about how long Priya had stayed. A slightly pointed question about whether I'd needed to give up my own bed those 2 nights, or whether Priya had simply taken it over. A comment I brushed off at first as ordinary curiosity, but that, in hindsight, was already showing its edges. I answered honestly each time, not thinking much of the pattern until it became harder to ignore, until the questions started arriving with a frequency that no longer felt casual. There was one particular evening, about 10 days after Marcus was rearrested, when Nadia and I were cleaning up after dinner. and she asked, almost too casually, whether Priya had said anything about me during those 2 nights on the couch, whether she'd mentioned anything specific. I told her the truth, that we'd mostly talked about the situation itself, about next steps, about logistics rather than anything personal. Nadia nodded, seemed to accept that answer, and then circled back to a version of the same question twice more before the evening was over, each time phrased slightly differently, like she was testing whether my answer would eventually crack open into something else. "Why did she go into your bedroom instead of just knocking?" she asked at one point, sitting across from me at my own kitchen table, the same table where Priya had told me everything a week and a half earlier. Why did she stay 2 nights instead of 1? Nadia never said outright that she was jealous. She framed it instead as simply wanting to understand. Phrases like, "I just think it's strange that," and "I just want to know why," repeating themselves over several conversations until the pattern became impossible to ignore. Each question technically reasonable on its own, but adding up to something that felt less like curiosity and more like an accusation dressed up as concern. I remember, at one point, trying to reassure her directly, telling her plainly that nothing had happened between Priya and me, that the whole situation had been exactly what it looked like: a woman in danger and someone willing to help her. Nadia said she believed me. But belief, I was learning, doesn't always settle the underlying unease that prompts a question in the first place. The sentence that landed hardest came a few days later, delivered almost gently, her voice soft in a way that made it somehow worse. "Do you know Priya has feelings for you? I'm not saying this to accuse anyone of anything. I just want you to be aware of where you actually stand." I didn't say anything in response. The comment wasn't factually wrong, as it turned out. I'd find that out for certain later. But the way it got introduced, into the middle of a genuine crisis, reframed after the fact into something murkier and more suspicious, weeks after the fact when the actual emergency had already passed, turned an act of straightforward decency into something that suddenly required defending, as though helping a frightened woman find safety was a decision that needed retroactive justification. Priya never heard that conversation directly, but Nadia mentioned it to her afterward, and Priya came to see me not long after, looking down rather than at me. Me, standing in my doorway with her arms crossed like she was bracing for something, the light in the hallway behind her catching the edge of her jacket, her voice quieter than I'd ever heard it before that moment. "I'm sorry for complicating things for you," she said. "You didn't do anything wrong," I told her. "I know," she said, "but that's not what the apology is for." A week after that particular exchange with Nadia, she and I sat down together. No shouting, no accusations thrown across the room, just 2 people sitting on opposite ends of a couch that had suddenly started feeling smaller than it used to. We simply arrived, both of us, at the understanding that the question she'd asked, "Where do you actually stand?" was really a question about the relationship the 2 of us had been in all along, not a question about Priya at all. Nadia admitted, eventually, that some part of her had been waiting for a reason to ask that question before that night ever happened, that the crisis had simply given the underlying uncertainty somewhere concrete to attach itself. She told me, with more honesty than I'd expected, that she'd started feeling for months like the 2 of us had settled into something comfortable rather than something she was genuinely excited about, and that watching how naturally I'd stepped up for Priya had made her realize she wanted that same instinctive care directed at her, and wasn't sure it was there anymore, if it ever fully had been. We ended things gently. Neither of us walked away as the villain in the story. I remember feeling more relief than sadness, which told me something about how long that particular ending had already been coming, before either of us said so out loud. I texted Priya not long after that, asking if she'd want to meet up. Not because I was feeling anything I hadn't already been feeling before. Because I knew she was carrying a guilt that never should have belonged to her in the first place, and that didn't sit right with me. The idea that a woman who'd survived months of genuine terror was now apologizing for the way she'd survived it, as though the manner of her escape mattered more than the fact that she'd gotten out safely at all. She showed up at a coffee shop in Logan Square, sitting upright, composed. The way I'd already noticed was her default posture whenever she needed to hold herself together. Hands folded neatly around a paper cup she hadn't yet opened. The same careful stillness I'd seen in her at Nadia's birthday dinner all those months earlier, before I understood what it actually cost her to maintain. I spoke first. "I didn't come here to tell you I'm fine," I said. "I came to tell you that what you did that night, using the key, coming in, needing help, none of it was wrong. And I don't want you carrying around the opposite idea." She didn't dress up her response. "Nadia says I have feelings for you." "She said something similar to me," I told her. "And what do you think?" she asked. "I think that night I saw someone who was scared, and I did the only thing that made any sense. I stayed. I said it simply, without embellishment, because that was the truest version of the story I had." "That's not an answer to my question," she said, a small, tired smile pulling at the corner of her mouth despite everything. The kind of smile that told me she wasn't upset with me for dodging, just genuinely curious how long I'd managed to keep dodging. "I know," I told her, "but it's the answer I wanted you to hear first." We sat with that for a moment, the coffee shop noise filling the space between us, someone's order being called out at the counter, the low hiss of the espresso machine, a couple arguing good-naturedly at a nearby table about whether they'd already seen the movie they were debating going to. I remember thinking, in that pause, that this was the first time Priya and I had ever actually sat across from each other with nothing urgent hanging over us, no crisis, no fear, just two people figuring out what came next. She pulled the old key out of her bag then, still wrapped in that blue tape, and set it on the table between us, the metal catching the light from the window behind her, a small worn object that had somehow ended up carrying so much more weight than its size suggested. "I should give this back. I should have given it back a while ago." I looked at the key. I didn't pick it up. "Keep it for now." "Why?" she asked. "In case you ever need it," I said. It wasn't a declaration of anything, but both of us understood it carried more weight than either of us had said out loud that morning. The first month after Nadia and I ended things, Priya and I didn't see each other much, not out of avoidance, just because both of us needed some room. She was working through the aftermath of everything with a counselor, taking her time processing what those months with Marcus had actually cost her, the accumulated weight of living under constant low-grade threat for the better part of a year, a weight I don't think either of us fully appreciated until she started describing it to me in pieces, weeks after the fact, once she finally had the distance to name it clearly. I stayed focused on work, letting the studio's rhythm fill up my own days the way it usually did, taking on a couple of extra projects mostly as a way of keeping my hands busy while everything else settled. We ran into each other, unplanned, at a grocery store a couple of weeks later, both of us reaching for the same brand of coffee at the same time, an off-brand blend that I'd have sworn nobody else in the city actually bought. We stood in the aisle laughing about it, nothing especially deep exchanged. "You doing okay?" I asked. "Better than last week," she said. "That's progress," I told her. We ended up talking in that aisle for a solid 15 minutes, blocking traffic for other shoppers, neither of us particularly bothered by that fact. Over the 2 months that followed, we started texting about small things, a podcast she was listening to, a mix I was working on that I couldn't quite get right. A documentary neither of us could remember the name of afterward, but had both apparently enjoyed, entire conversations built out of nothing more significant than what either of us happened to be doing that particular evening. Priya came by the studio once, just to watch, no agenda beyond curiosity. She sat on the old couch we keep in the corner, headphones on, listening to a track come together while I worked, occasionally offering an opinion I hadn't asked for, but was glad to hear anyway. Neither of us said a word for close to 2 hours at one point, both of us simply existing in the same quiet space. The hum of the mixing board, the only sound between us. That was the moment I understood, clearly, that this was exactly the kind of person I wanted around. Someone who could sit comfortably in silence, who didn't need constant conversation to feel like the time together mattered. Nadia and Priya eventually talked things through, once enough time had passed for the sting to fade. Their friendship survived, though it took real effort on both sides. Several long conversations that Priya later told me had been harder than almost anything else that whole year, harder in some ways than the fear of Marcus had been, because this was a wound between two people who genuinely loved each other, rather than a threat from someone who never had. There was one particular conversation, Priya told me, where the two of them sat in Nadia's car outside a grocery store for over an hour, neither willing to get out until they'd actually said everything that needed saying. Both of them crying at different points, both of them apologizing for different things. Nadia's a mature enough person to recognize she'd handled the middle part of that story badly, even while understanding she'd gotten the beginning and end of it right. She'd given Priya the key in the first place, after all, the very thing that had kept her safe that night. It's autumn in Chicago now, 3 months since that night. I'm standing at my kitchen window, listening to rain against the glass, the same kind of steady autumn rain that had been falling the night Priya first showed up soaked and shaking on the edge of my bed, though the feeling in the room now couldn't be more different. On the counter in front of Priya sits a key. No blue tape this time, not a spare copy of anything, just a plain brass key I'd had cut that morning at the hardware store 2 blocks over, standing in line behind someone arguing about the price of a garden hose. She looks at it longer than the moment probably requires, turning it slightly in the light from the window. Then she picks it up. "No tape this time," she says. "Because this one's not a spare," I tell her. She slides the key into her jacket pocket. Neither of us needs to say anything more. We stand there for a moment in the quiet of my kitchen, the rain still falling outside, and I think about how different this exact scene is from the one that started everything. Not fear this time, not urgency, just two people who found their way toward each other through the aftermath of something neither of us had asked for. I think about that first night more than you'd expect, given how much time has passed. Not the fear of it, though there was plenty of that in the moment. What stays with me is the specific quality of Priya's composure, even while she was shaking. The way she managed to say, "Don't freak out," instead of simply breaking down, as though some part of her, even in genuine crisis, was still thinking about how her fear might land on someone else. I've come to understand that's simply who she is, someone who carries her own weight carefully, even when carrying it alone is the last thing she should have to do. I've told her since that I wish she'd felt she could break down completely that night, that she didn't need to manage my reaction on top of managing her own fear. And she's told me, in turn, that she's working on that slowly, the same way she's worked on everything else this year. Some people ask me why I didn't panic the moment I saw Priya sitting in my room that night. The truth is, I did, for about half a second. But the other half of that second, I looked at her eyes and understood immediately this wasn't a situation that was actually about me at all. I think that's the part of the story people find hardest to believe, that fear and clarity can arrive in the same instant, that you can be startled awake and still know, almost simultaneously, exactly what the moment actually requires of you. There's a particular quality to the trust that gets built between two people after something like that. It doesn't move at the pace of ordinary dating, doesn't follow the usual script of getting to know someone gradually over dinners and small talk. Priya and I skipped most of that. We went straight to the parts most couples don't reach until much later, sitting with someone through genuine fear, learning what they sound like when they're barely holding it together, understanding exactly what they need without having to ask. Everything that came afterward, all the slow, ordinary building of an actual relationship, felt almost like catching up on steps we'd somehow managed to skip past in reverse order. I sat with all of that for a long time in the months that followed, turning it over the way I turn over a mix that isn't quite right yet. Grief and fear aren't opposites in the way people assume, and I've learned, watching Priya rebuild her sense of safety this past year, that courage isn't the absence of shaking hands. Sometimes it's simply choosing where to go when your hands are shaking, and trusting the person you find there. Nadia asked the wrong question, not because she's a bad person, because she asked it at the wrong moment, about the wrong situation entirely. People do that sometimes when they're afraid of losing something. When uncertainty about a relationship finds the nearest available explanation and attaches itself there instead of sitting with the harder, quieter truth. I'm not angry with her for it. But I also can't pretend that question didn't reveal something true about the relationship we were already in. Something that was probably going to surface eventually, regardless of what happened that particular night. I think, in a strange way, that night simply accelerated a conversation the two of us would have needed to have sooner or later anyway. Priya walked into my apartment at 2:30 in the morning, not because she wanted anything from me. She walked in because she needed somewhere safe, and somebody had trusted her enough to leave a key behind for exactly that reason. I just happened to be the one asleep in that apartment when it mattered. The one person in the whole equation who didn't need convincing to simply show up, who didn't ask her to justify her fear before offering her somewhere to set it down. Everything else, we built ourselves. Slowly. Without rushing it. The way I think most things worth having actually get built. Not in a single dramatic moment, but in a long series of small, ordinary choices that only look significant once you're far enough away to see the shape of them. Once enough time has passed that you can finally trace the line from that first frightened night to whatever steady, quiet thing came after it. So let me ask you something. Have you ever ended up in the right place at the right moment, not because of luck, but because someone trusted you enough to need you there? And if someone said, "Don't freak out," before explaining anything at all, would you have had the composure to ask the right question instead of the first one that came to mind, the one that would have made the moment about you instead of about them? If this story reminds you of someone, the person you'd trust enough to call at 2 in the morning, no explanation required, leave a comment below. Like this video if you believe the right thing to do is sometimes simply to stay quiet and show up. And subscribe for next week's story about ordinary people and the ordinary decisions that turn into something entirely unexpected.